Well, yesterday when we talked about or started talking about Paul's instructions to Titus in terms of building up the church that was on the Isle of Crete, apparently something had been newly founded and had a lot of new believers, was that it was really important that he address really one of their most underlying cultural faults, and that was kind of a tendency to not tell the truth. Now, every culture is struck with that. And in fact, I think one of my favorite quotes is from Alexander Solzhenitsyn, who, speaking about the Soviets when he was living in the Soviet Union, he says, "They lied to us. We know they lied to us." He says, "We know that they know that we know that they lied to us, but they still lied to us." In other words, they lied because they dare not tell the truth, because the truth would just undermine everything that they were trying to hold on to. But also they had become so accustomed with living with lies that they just hoped that reality would adjust itself accordingly. And so we find oftentimes that people who tell lies don't have the realization that lies have to deal with reality, the real world. And eventually the real world will collide with their lie and it will all come down with a great crash. And I think that's something that we need to recognize, because over the years, one of the things that's really kind of bothered me, and it should bother us, I guess, is that I've heard and followed and read and heard the stories of different people who had these very dramatic personal testimonies of how they came to Christ and what they were into before they were saved, and then they got saved, and how dramatic that salvation was, and so forth. And these people were making a good living, traveling around from church to church, even having movies sometimes made about them as they told these stories. Well, as their stories began to grow, there's always somebody out there who's kind of a skeptic, somebody who kind of picks up something that doesn't really ring true. And by calling them skeptic, I am not being critical. I'm not critical of skepticism. What I'm critical of is cynicism. Cynicism is something where we just have a negative, divisive, and canceling kind of view of everything. We don't believe anything or anyone. We're just really extremely distrustful to the point of being antisocial. But a skeptic is somebody who basically says it doesn't make sense until it makes sense. I'm married to somebody like that, and I'm thankful for it, because a lot of times she'll just look at something and say, I don't know, that just doesn't make sense to me. And the more we look at it, the more we realize there's a reason it doesn't make sense, because it's not sensible, or it's not true, or it's not real, or it's not based upon fact. And so I can only imagine what it must have been like for Titus, that I'm dealing with a culture where dishonesty is so much a part of the cultural value system that you have to question and have proof behind everything. It's kind of like Ananias and Sapphira in the 5th chapter of Acts, who were lying to God, lying to the Holy Spirit, and before that they lied to Peter and claimed to have done something that they hadn't done, and it led to their early death. And I think about that sometimes, that there's not a fear of God before them. One of the things that Paul said in Romans chapter 2, he says, all men are liars. And that's kind of a convicting statement, or at least it should be convicting, because I think we need to learn how to question our own veracity sometimes. That we can many times think something, and it's part of our imagination, but it's not part of our real life experience. And the more creative your imagination, the more you can enhance something. I'll give you an example from my own life. I remember I was speaking at a church with somebody that I had done mission work in Russia with, and I was sharing one of our experiences that I recalled very, very clearly, and I believe very accurately, and it was really very, very funny. And after church, we were having lunch. I said, I got that story right, didn't I? And he looked at me and said, no, but I liked your version better. Well, all I can say is I wasn't trying to be dishonest. I wasn't trying to fabricate something. But the way I recalled it was not the same way that he recalled it. We'll have to wait till we get to heaven to find out who had the true take on that story. But to say all of that, we have a lack of total objectivity about things that we look at. In other words, when you look at an object, you look at a situation, you look at an event in your life, you process that event not based upon what you saw, but how your mind interprets what it saw. And that's where we really need to be prayerful that God would help us to restore our minds, transform our minds so that we measure things against God's truth and not just our own feelings, our own opinions. One of the hardest things I find to convincing people today of is that your feelings can be completely unreliable. I mean, I find it all the time. I can wake up and for some reason I can be in a dark mood and I'm sitting there thinking, wow, why am I so dark and why is everything so terrible? Now, in this part of the world, when we have about 7 or 8 hours of sunlight at best, and those hours of sunlight are usually cloud covered, you literally are living most of your life in the darkness, literally, and it can easily get kind of blue, especially for people like me who need to get a lot of vitamin D and love to be soaking in the sun. But to say all of that, many times if I've really got down and said, God, what is really going on? And it's really, I find that somewhere in my mind, I begin to go down this dark tunnel. And for some people, that leads to a deep, deep depression and sense of discouragement. And the reality is we forget that God is on the throne, God is in control. The world may, as the proverbial saying goes, going to hell in a handbasket. It always has been going to hell in a handbasket. That's not a new dynamic. And for us Americans, it's just that it never has been as bad for us as it was in most of the world, and certainly not as bad in most of our history. And so it's, at least in our generation. So you can easily begin to get a very dark view of the world when you see wickedness being promoted all around you. But at the same time, what you have to keep in mind is that God is still God. And I think what happens is we forget that we were created for eternity. We weren't created for time. And that's one of the checks that I find in my heart all the times. I realize that I'm really wanting my life to be my best life now, as someone once put it, when in fact, I want my life, and I should want my life to be the best that it can be for God. Lord, I want to be, in constant, continuous communion with you. I want to be a fully devoted follower of Jesus Christ. And when I get looking at the waves and the winds, and I begin to cry out, Lord, save us where we're drowning, really I've lost sight of the fact that he is the Lord of the universe. All the apostles had to do is look at Jesus and realize that he wasn't losing any sleep over the storm, and said, well, if he's not worried, I shouldn't be worried. And sometimes I find that when I just spend some time with the Lord in his word and in prayer, meditating upon his truth, I kind of disconnect from all that noise out there, that somehow there's a calmness that comes in my heart. And I realize God is not stressed by my situation, so I shouldn't be either. I'll never forget a time in my life where, in the ministry several years ago, where we'd gone through some really very painful season in the ministry, and financially we were not going to survive as a church. And I remember, this was 15 years ago, factually. I remember it. And I remember talking to our accountant, and he said, well, you've been here 25 years. You had a great run. And he was saying, nothing lasts forever. And I'm thinking, that's not very comforting. And so I went to my prayer closet. I got on my knees and said, look, God, it is your church. It's your problem, not my problem. If you want this to end, then your will be done. If you don't, then it's up to you to fix the problem. And no sooner had I finished praying that prayer, the phone rang, and my wife called and said, we just received the largest donation that we'd ever gotten in the history of the church. I think to this day, it's the largest single donation we ever got. And the irony was, not only did the income begin to grow almost spontaneously, but we were able to put that money in reserve and use it for things later on down the road. We didn't even have to rely upon it. And it really brought home to me how that God was simply saying, you've got to realize it's not your church, and that I'm still God, and you may be crying, Lord, we're going to drown if you don't save us. But if he's not worried, you shouldn't be worried. And here's a little hint. I don't tell everybody this. He's not worried. He never has been. He is the author. He is the finisher. He is the one that started it all. He's the one who finishes everything. And so when Jesus said to his disciples, said to the waves, peace and be still, and suddenly everything went calm, they fell back on their heels and said, what manner of man is this, that even the winds and the waves listen to him? And the answer is really simple. He's the God who said, let there be light. And there was light. He was the God who was hovering over the deep darkness of this planet and suddenly caused it to come to life. And created everything in 6 days and then kicked back on the seventh day. So, I mean, it's that understanding of who he is. We lose sight of the grandeur of our God, and somehow we think that without our help, everything was going to fall apart. God knows what's going on. He sees the dynamics of our culture, and he wants us to focus on speaking truth into that culture, not going into some kind of cowardly silence or withdrawal, as happens in most countries that end up being toppled by totalitarianism and despotism. People, instead of speaking out against things that are not true, simply keep their heads down so that they can survive and not get it shot off. I think for many of us, we have to think, I'd rather have my head cut off because I'm speaking the truth than to live my life whole until I grow old and regret the fact that I never stood up and spoke when I had the chance. Just my thought on the matter. Well, we'll continue tomorrow. God bless.